Hello everyone, welcome to another Shmup topic video. Today I have a very special guest. You all know him, you all love him. Shmup Junkie, welcome to the channel, my dude.
Hey Mark, great to be on here again. I always enjoy doing podcasts with you. You're the only person I think I do podcasts with. So.
That's right, I'm the only one who's able to bother you enough to get you to, I just nip at your heels long enough to get you come on the show, basically. Well, I really wanted to have you on because this topic, for introduction to the audience, is a debate as old as time. Back in the Stone Ages, they're talking, did it begin with the chicken or the egg? Quickly thereafter, the topic of what is a shoot 'em up? What is a shmup? What are the parameters of the genre? What makes one game a shmup and not a shmup? And you're all probably thinking, Mark, this is a pretty basic ass concept. Do you need to really make a whole video about that? Can't we just look on Wikipedia, right? Why don't we just pop open Wikipedia and take a look? Well, if you look for any definition of shmup anywhere, you will not find one. It does not exist anywhere. And the closest you get is stuff like, if you pop open Wikipedia right now, it'll say, there's no consensus of what a shmup is, but, it's got spaceships, it's in arcades, you'll figure it out. There is no solid definition, no parameters, and every 4 or 5 months, this topic comes up. A bunch of us argue about it on Discord. We yell at each other, and then by the end of it, everyone throws their hands in the air and says, oh, what's it matter? Who gives a shit? We'll talk about it later. And this has gone on for probably decades now. So being someone who gets a little bit into the weeds on some of these topics, I've been thinking about this on a ridiculous amount over the years, and I want to put something forward, and I'm not saying it's 100% definitive, but I do think it is a much better starting point than what we have now, which is whatever. A shmup is what your heart believes, or whatever after school specials types of things people tend to say. So that's sort of my introduction to why we're doing this video, because even though it seems like this is just all academic, it actually comes up a lot, almost all the time, because the way it works is defining a shmup does not matter until it matters. And then when it matters, no one knows what to do. So here are some scenarios that I've come across where it matters what a shmup is. The first one is obviously forums, Discord servers, Reddits. There's a lot of them that are dedicated to shmups, shoot 'em ups specifically. You can't just post whatever you want on there, but at the same time, can I post Metal Slug on these places? Could I post Star Fox 64? You post Star Fox 64 on there, you're going to get half the thread saying, what the hell is this? This isn't a shmup. And then the other half saying, oh, it's totally a shmup. It counts, right? So there's one scenario where it comes up all the time. Another one is if you're going to participate in a shmup event, like Shmup Slam that I run, I kind of have to decide what gets in and what gets not in. And sometimes games are submitted where I'm like, Fortnite, buddy, Dota. I hate to tell you, but it's, it's not a shmup. So in shmup events, it also matters that you know what the genre is. Another big one that comes up all the time is for marketing and for promoting the genre. So you go out, you're explaining to people, oh, you want to try out a shmup? I like shmups. And they say, well, what is it? I was actually on a speedrunning podcast and they asked me this. They're like, yeah, so what's a shmup, Mark? And I'm like, oh boy. And I just blah, blah, blah. Whatever I said, it wasn't, I'll play a clip of it. It wasn't good. And I was like,
talk to us a little bit about shmups. What are shmups in the simplest terms?
All right, well, I guess for a more formal definition, shmups are a genre of video games where you're basically locked into scrolling, and the goal of shmups is really shooting enemies, dodging bullets, and getting high scores.
Okay.
Face palming the whole time because I couldn't even explain what a shmup was. So I just also think it's deeply embarrassing for the genre that we all sit around, we talk about how much we love them, how they're the best, how they're the superior genre and what we live for. And then when you ask, okay, well, what is it? You're like, I don't know. You kind of get the idea, right? So those are sort of my motivations for making this video and trying to at least tackle this somewhat. So I'm really happy to have Shmup Junkie here because I want to get his perspective, because he came from an era where shmup was not the default term. And in fact, a lot of people are kind of annoyed at the term. So I'd love to get your perspective of the evolution of the naming convention of the genre.
Oh, sure. I'll be up front first. Honestly, this isn't a topic I've thought about a lot. I mentioned it before. When I think of a shmup, I never tried to define it. I never saw a reason to or thought to. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. It's like I never defined it in my mind, but I know when I see one, and I think a lot of people think that way.
Absolutely.
So, and I'm not saying that's right. You have a lot of good reasons for why you need to define something, in some way. Even if it's not completely rigid, you need to have some kind of a structure around it. And for me, like I said, I didn't even know what the term shmup was until, the advent of the internet, most likely, because it's just not a word that existed or was used in any way. We grew up calling them shooters or shoot 'em ups.
Do you remember the first time you heard the term shmup? Like, what was the first time you saw that?
I literally probably saw it online somewhere. I don't remember where it was, but I didn't know what it meant. I really had no idea. I had to kind of research or to look it up, or maybe I was reading a review of some kind, and it used the term shmup, and I'm like, what's a shmup?
Right.
My background is that, we called it shooters and shoot 'em ups, and the only reason we started calling them something else is because we needed a way to differentiate them from first-person shooters that started to become extremely popular, around a certain time in the 90s. You grow up calling a game a certain thing, R-Type, Gradius, any type of game. It's a shooter, it's a shoot 'em up. That's just what we called them in regular conversation. And all of a sudden, there came a time where I started using the word shooter and people didn't know what I was talking about. Or more aptly, they thought I was talking about a first-person shooter. They thought I was talking about Call of Duty or Halo or something like that. In just random conversation, I might be chatting or we having a conversation, and I call it a shooter, and they're like, "Oh, you mean like so-and-so?" No,
Right, exactly.
It's not like Call of Duty. That's not what I meant. And then I have to explain it to them. And we didn't make up our own term. I would just always explain it. No, that's not what I meant. I was talking about this kind of game. Like, oh, okay, I understand now. And eventually it just became annoying because I couldn't use the word shooter anymore because people didn't know what I was talking about. So I had to preface it and explain it. And then when we started saying shmup, then I finally understood, okay, shmup is the new term. It's like, now I have a way of differentiating, what I'm talking about, so it doesn't get confused, if that makes sense, because it was always causing confusion. This is anecdotal. I'm not making it up. I literally remember the time in my life where I started using the term shooter and people thought I was talking about something else. And in a way, it kind of created an animosity towards an annoyance. Like, why do I have to use the term shmup? That doesn't make, it's almost like something was stolen from us. It's like now I have to change my vocabulary and call the games that I've been calling something forever something else, just so people can know what I'm talking about. And that's where the whole shmups are shooters came about. And when I'm, like the t-shirt I'm wearing, for example.
Yes. I was hoping you'd wear it. I was really hoping.
Pretty much always do, yeah. So it was a hashtag we created just for the idea that shmups are shooters. That's what they are. Like, they're the original name for it. When I say shmup or shooter, I'm referring to the same type of game. So then I think that's where, for the longest time, I didn't want to use the term shmup. It's funny, like it bothered me because I felt
I've seen that a lot from other people.
And it didn't bother me because I didn't like the way it sounded or something weird like that. It was literally because it felt like a word that was forced on us to use just because shooter was taken away from us. It's like, Call of Duty came around and stole the word.
Boy. Yeah.
And we can't use it anymore, right? So obviously we all got over that. I made peace with it. It's, we're talking about video games. I wouldn't call myself Shmup Junkie if I had a problem with the word shmup anymore.
Right.
But going back far enough, like I'm talking like, decade and a half to, 20 years ago, I can remember that mindset of, not wanting to use the word or not using it for that simple reason. Because it felt like, shooter was stolen from us and we wanted it back, which we couldn't, obviously.
I had an experience just like that in high school where I was mildly popular in middle school and I went by my last name as like a term of endearment. Everyone called me by my last name. Well, some other kid moved to this school with the same last name. He went by the same last name and he straight up just stole my nickname. So I had to go to Mark. I had to go from my nickname to Mark because this guy was more popular and more cool than I. So it's like, sorry, bro, your name is now mine. now you're relegated to just your first name, and there's 12 marks. You know, there's a million marks. I know that experience of like having something that you're really used to and like really being attached to that naming convention, and then the sands of the popular culture or the conversation shift, and all of a sudden you're like shoved off in the corner, like, all right, buddy, now it's shmups. My experience is a little different because I was much more familiar with first-person shooters, third-person shooters, and all that stuff for years and years before ever recognizing arcade shmups as shooters, right? So when we'd go to the arcade, I mean, obviously we'd play stuff like Raiden, of course, but what's funny is the way we identified shmups in our minds was, oh, that's Raiden. When we'd see anything like Raiden, we'd be like, oh, that's a Raiden game. It's like Raiden-like. So that's actually how I viewed the genre for years, is anything that was like Raiden, oh, that's Raiden. Or Raiden, you know, it's like Raiden. That's how you'd explain it. Oh, it's like Raiden. So that was like the shmup in my head for a long time. Then I went over to my friend's house, and he's like, oh, I've got this really cool shmup on my Xbox. He hacked his Xbox. It was Sexy Parodius, and he played it purely because of the name Sexy Parodius, and it was supposed to be naughty, and we're like, oh, cool. So that's actually how I came across the term shmup for the first time. Then I said, oh, okay, so Raiden is a shmup. And so in my mind, I never associated the genre with the term shooter at any point until actually I started getting into the genre more, and, you know, some people get cranky when you say shmup. And so I feel like the conversation has like gone in like a circle where it started off shooter, and then you'd say, oh, it's shmups now. And then you start saying shmups, and then a whole nother wave of people would be like, oh, don't call them shmups because that's incorrect. They're actually shooters. And then this other group would be like, actually, they're STG. So let's call them STG because that's proper Japanese term. And so like it's just a whole mess now as far as what the hell we call this genre.
Oh, I realized at some point, and I don't know when it was, is, you know, originally I just saw shmup as a shorthand. You know, shmup is short for shoot 'em up, you know,
right,
just so
exactly.
you don't have to write, just so you don't have to write it out. But at some point I realized that that's not, culturally or historically, not necessarily the case. The word shmup, it was created a long time ago, and I don't know who created it or what magazine used it.
Yes.
But it wasn't popularized until there was a need for it. And the need became when we needed to differentiate the genre because people were confusing shooter with other games. So shmup has a very specific meaning in my mind now, as opposed to just being shorthand. Shmup is a very specific type of game because the term became popular and started getting used to differentiate a specific genre, as opposed to shooter, which can refer to a pretty wide swath of games. There's a lot of type of games that are shooting games or shooters, you know, or what you call, you know, in Japan, of course, I think their definition of STG is probably pretty narrow. You know, I don't think they see all these different kinds of games as STGs.
Though sometimes they will sneak in stuff that I wouldn't consider a shmup. Like they'll put like a running gun sometimes in the STG category. So they're a little loose with that too. It's not...
Are they?
It's not nearly as loose as shooter, which is like, right now everyone at home, homework, type shooter in Google now and hit search. You're going to get like all kinds of mobile games and all kinds of random shit. If you type shmup, you will get mostly that I've seen what we consider to be STG, shmups, old school shooters, however you want to refer to them. You'll get, it's like much more precise of a search definition by far. And that's probably, I'm assuming that's one reason why you went with Shmup Junkie, because if you went with Shooter Junkie, you might be like a firearms channel, you might be, I don't know, like a band, you know, it could be anything.
It sounds like I walked into the wrong dark alley.
Yeah, Shooter Junkie. It's kind of a cool name though, I'm not gonna lie.
So in my mind, at some point I realized that, you know, shmup, you know, linguistically means more than just shoot 'em up. It's not just a shorthand. You know, when we use the term shmup in the community, it refers to a very specific kind of game that's a lot more narrow than shoot 'em ups or shooters in general, because that could encompass, you know, twin stick shooters and other types of shooters. There's so many.
That's exactly right. So I'm going to show on screen here. This is a very rough little sketch I put together. But in my mind, the way I sort of explain this now to people is shooter has now become the umbrella genre. So that is like the last name of all of the shooters, right? So like shmup, last name shooter. It's the umbrella genre. And then underneath it, you get the subgenres, one of them being the shmup. And then running guns, gallery shooters, multi-directional shooters, and those are all the 2D ones. And then when you move into the 3D, some of those subgenres start to converge together, and then some don't. Like, I would argue that going from 2D to 3D, the rail shooter is just a 3D shmup. Like, it has all the elements of a shmup, now it's in 3D. But then a first-person shooter, we'll get into the elements here in a little bit. A first-person shooter is like a combination of all these other different types of shooters coming together. It's multi-directional, but you also are running and gunning. And there's jumps, and it's like all these crazy other elements that you couldn't quite do completely in 2D, or like a gallery shooter where you can sort of move your cursor around the screen in first person and all that. All those kind of come together in the 3D in kind of an interesting merge, but a family of games together under the umbrella of shooter. What do you think about that idea?
I guess it makes sense. Like I said before, I haven't really thought too much into it because it's not something I spent a lot of time trying to ever categorize. But I definitely agree with you that, just because something is 3D doesn't mean it can't be a shmup or a shooter or anything else. As long as it has the same elements, like your example of whether it's Space Harrier or Star Fox or any of those kinds of games, you'll get into the criteria later, but obviously it ticks all the boxes for what a traditional shooter would be considered. Just because it's in 3D doesn't disqualify it. Yes. A first-person shooter obviously is different because the primary mechanic of the game is very different than something like, Star Fox. At its very core, not a shmup.
Yes. I would consider them sort of a family. They'd be under the shooter category. So it is. Yeah. So Steam is kind of right, where if you go into Steam and you go into the shooter section, you'll get a shmup in there, but you also get like Double Daggers in there too, or all kinds of games. Shooters so broad if you go into Steam.
I mean, for me, by habit, I never call those games shooters because I'm not used to it, because I grew up calling, what we consider shmups shooters. So when I use the term shooter on my channel and when I talk about games, I am specifically referring to, more of a traditional shmup type of game. I never call Call of Duty a shooter just because in my mind, that's not what it is. It's an FPS or it's a first-person shooter, and I always called it first-person shooter. I never... Because I come from the old school, it's not the type of game we call shooters. It wasn't until the new generation that grew up with them that just by default called them shooters. And that's where all the confusion started in the first place. Oh, yeah. And so I'll never do it, but I accept the fact that time has passed, and that's what it is now.
We want to get to the core, the fundamental building blocks. And I really think there's only 3 specific ones that I will hang my hat on and say, okay, you have to have these 3 elements. Otherwise, you land in a subgenre, which could be very much related. It could be a shooter, it could be very close, but it's not exactly the genre, it's a subgenre related. It's like a cousin. And I want to get your kind of thoughts on this criteria too. And I have talked about this a lot on Discord, so it'd be interesting to see what you think. So the first one I always kind of say is that a shmup needs to have free 8-way movement. So you need to be able to move up, down, left, right, and then diagonally as well. And you can't be confined by gravity. So, you put a gun in Mario's hand, Metal Slug, Contra, they're constrained by gravity. That is not a shmup. You need to be able to move across the screen fully in all 8 directions. So that would be my first criteria for that, because that's like the foundation of your skill set as a shmup player, is moving that ship precisely and moving it in. What makes shmups so compelling is the amount of freedom in the movement. And so when you start constraining that and removing that, you're starting to move out of the genre and into other subgenres, I would say. What do you think about that first criteria?
It's interesting. I think, like any criteria, it'll basically be correct for like 95% of things. Mm-hmm. And then you'll always have those outliers where you look at it and go, yeah, maybe this game doesn't quite do that, but it's in the spirit of what you're going for, so it's kind of an exception. So one example would be like a recent video I did for the arcade action games was Wolfang. That game very much looks and plays and acts like a traditional shooter, and many people would say a shmup. But it's a game that confines you to a plane. You can jump, but you cannot go freely up and down except for certain sections of the game. It's very much a shooting game. The core gameplay is based around shooting and dodging, but it's constrained, and that's part of the mechanics of the game, is you can't just freely move up and down. So you could, based on this criteria, something like Wolfing would not be considered a shmup, which I'm okay with. I don't have a problem with that.
I don't know that game specifically. Would it be more like run and gun? Like you're running on a plane?
Well, it's basically an auto-scrolling game. I think you've seen it before, and you thought it looked cool.
Yeah, it looked interesting, but I didn't notice any, it
auto-scrolls, and it's constantly moving, and you have to move and jump to avoid, obviously projectiles. But the core of the gameplay is shooting and dodging and jumping to avoid, whatever. There's no pitfalls, there's no platforming, there's no obstacles in that sense.
Right.
It's just a game where you're locked to the ground because you're not flying.
Right.
Except for very specific portions of the game.
Sounds like an auto-scrolling run and gun to me. It kind of, because you have to jump and you're not flying. It doesn't sound like.
You could potentially call it that. Yeah, it's just very fast-paced, compared to your typical run and gun. It has the pacing of a shmup. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yes.
It has the bullet patterns. It has the enemy patterns. And the pacing of what you would consider a traditional shmup. If you see it, the traditional idea of if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it is. And most people who look at it will look at it and think, hey, this game looks like a shmup, whether it is or it isn't.
And that's a tricky part of this too, because some games will fall right outside of the criteria. And this is to your point, but they're so on their own that they can't have their own genre, right? Like they can't. For this example, this seems like a good example. So it auto-scrolls. That's one of the criteria. The combat is focused around dodging projectiles or avoiding projectiles. So that sounds like that's another core of the game. Yep. You just can't fly. You're just stuck on the ground. So it is so close. But it's probably like one of a kind type of game, right? But what I'm saying is, if that trend continued and more games followed this style of gameplay, I would say it would actually end up qualifying for its own subgenre at some point, because it would start to have its own meta. It would start to have its own completely own skill set, because you're not able to use that 8-way movement. You have to start using more like platformer techniques, I'd assume, or something. Like it could be a really great bridge too to the shmup genre for people who speedrun platformers and stuff. So that one is tricky, right? Because it's just kind of right outside the realm of what I'd consider a shmup, but it's like close enough that you could welcome it in, but kind of like a hey buddy.
And I'm just playing devil's advocate. That's the only purpose. It's like I'm looking at going, okay, this, anytime you have a criteria, it'll fit, 95 or 99% of the games, and there's always going to be those outliers that don't fit any other genre, because it's not a platformer, and it's not really a run and gun, and it's not a beat 'em up. It plays more like a shmup than any other genre, but it just doesn't happen to fit completely into the criteria.
Yeah, another one that comes up a lot with this is the older, really old shmups like Space Invaders and those types of things. And those actually had their own subgenre, which I agreed with, which were called proto shmups. So they're like the blueprint of what became a shmup, but they lack the 8-way movement, right? You're just moving left and right and shooting. And you could say, it's close. It's very close, kind of like the other game, the Wolf game we're talking about, but it's not quite the same, right? It's not quite there. It doesn't have the full spectrum of the genre.
But nobody would ever argue that Space Invaders isn't a shooter. It is the shooter. It's
definitely a shooter. So. It's definitely in the shooter umbrella. Absolutely.
It's the original shooter. I mean, shooters would not exist without it in that form. So it is it.
I would give it the title of like a proto shooter, proto shmup. I've heard that, and I think that's a good description of it.
I mean, that's why they called them shooting games. That's exactly what it was. Regardless of whether it scrolled or it didn't at the time, that didn't exist, so it was a shooting game.
Yes, and single screen games are very interesting, and I'm glad we're talking about that, because that's the next criteria. So the next criteria, and this one I think is very fundamental, is a shmup must auto scroll. And I want to describe this correctly, because this is the one that gives the people the most trouble whenever I bring it up on Discord or discuss it, forums, or wherever I talk about it. Is because auto-scrolling is fundamental to the way the game is programmed, but we're not focusing in on the surface elements. So people would say, oh, okay, so you remove the background of Dodonpachi, now it's not a shmup. It's not about the literal visual of the background scroll. It's about how the game is programmed. And the way auto-scrollers work is that the game's movement and progression is not at the agency of the player. There is a godlike force pushing the game along, and no matter what you do, it will push, it will go, and you are locked into this specific amount of time. And the reason why this is so fundamental is because it adds this third dimension of the gameplay, which is this forced timing, where no matter what you do, no matter what you think, the game will progress in time in a reliable manner. There's actually a really easy test to see if a game auto-scrolls or not, which is you start the game and you set down your controller. What happens? In non-auto-scrolling games, which is the majority of games, nothing will happen. Your character will sit there, the game won't progress, maybe a timer will tick, but the game is not forcing you forward. It can beat you up, it can throw bombs at you, it can kill you with a timer, but it is not moving that stage forward. You're just still sitting there. Where in the shmup and other auto-scrollers, you can even see this in Mario levels that auto-scroll, it'll just push Mario along. It's like, okay, Mario, you're coming for the ride whether you want to or not. That is the auto-scroll. And in my opinion, that is what gives shmups their visceral nature. That's what gives them their timing elements, their sense of rhythm. And when you take that away, you completely shift the design of the game fundamentally, because when you program a shmup, you have to program them differently than platformers, because you have to program an object to move the game, rather than in a platformer, everything's tied to the player. If the player goes left, the game goes left. If the player goes right, the game goes right. It's all tied to the player, not in an auto-scroller. So what do you think about that criteria?
By that definition, even Space Invaders would be considered an auto-scroller.
That's
because
right. That's
the background's not moving, but they're moving down towards you. It's the same thing, and
yes,
they're going to continue in there until you either kill them or you die.
That's exactly right. I'm glad you brought up single screen games, because they're the trickiest, because you have to get a little bit more in depth on how you look at the game. You have to look at it from more of a coding perspective, because single screen, that screen ain't moving. That's the only thing, right? But the game is actually progressing. It is spawning the enemies. It is progressing the AI. If you had like an invulnerability cheat, I'm sure the game would just continue on. The boss would spawn, and all that sort of stuff. Like, the game would progress. Whereas in Super Mario Bros., if you just had invulnerability cheat and Mario sat there, the game would not move. You would just, that was it. Nothing's happening. So single screen games are tricky like that. But yes, I would consider them, a lot of them, auto-scrollers. And then another one that people get caught up on is boss fights. They'd say, well, boss fights don't auto-scroll, right? Because in most boss fights, the background stops. But the game's code is actually continuing to run. It's not like you fight the boss and you can just get up and go get a sandwich. The game will continue to play whether or not you're there. So bosses continue the auto-scrolling. They're just not visually moving. Some of them are, though. DOJ, the scroll continues, actually.
Either way, I wouldn't even consider a boss to matter, because, it's not the core of the gameplay. Okay, so the entire level scrolled, you have to beat a boss before you move on to the next auto-scrolling level. Just because the boss doesn't scroll doesn't completely invalidate, the rest of the mechanics of the game. So I wouldn't make that argument for a boss anyway. As opposed to Mario levels that auto-scroll, just because they auto-scroll doesn't make it a shmup. Obviously it takes more than that.
You need the other criteria. You need the other, all three.
And I hate to be a devil's advocate, but I bring it up again, like, for any criteria, when you're talking about auto-scrolling, I always bring up that game In the Hunt, because most people consider that game a shmup, because again, it fits every other criteria so perfectly, but In the Hunt does not auto-scroll.
It has 8-way movement, I'm assuming, right?
Absolutely. It's full 8-way movement. It's this shooting and dodging projectiles. It's a shmup in every sense of the word, except you have control of the scrolling. It's like metal. It's like Metal Slug, but
that's
without.
Right. Yeah, I was about to say.
But without the ability to jump. You can't jump. You don't come out of the water. You're basically you scroll, but you're only scrolling left to right and occasionally up and down. Like you're progressing the screen, but you can stop it.
That's right. There's other shmups. There's other shmup-related games or shmup subgenres like this, like Fantasy Zone, Defender. Yeah, that's the other one, right? Where it has the other elements, right? So you have the ability to move in 8 directions. You're dodging projectiles primarily in the combat, but you have a fixed scroll. You're able to control the scroll. And in my opinion, that would move it into a subgenre. The thing is that we all say, like, oh, it's a shmup, but we all recognize there is a difference. between that style of game and like a Dodonpachi, Mishima-sama, Battle Garegga, the list goes on. We all know, okay, there is this difference here that's pretty fundamental. It's pretty key. So I would say that's like a subgenre, but it isn't like a full-on traditional shmup because it lacks the auto-scroll.
Yeah, well, auto-scrolling in general completely changes the way a game plays. You know, whether it's a shmup or a platformer or anything, you know, auto-scrolling changes everything because it becomes more of a rhythm game than not. So it's kind of, you know, I completely get that. And, you know, if it's disqualified as being a shmup, then it is.
Yes.
I only bring it up because it's always a game that I thought of as a shmup because it literally looks, plays, and acts like one. You know, in other words, it would be you would have a very hard time convincing someone that In the Hunt is a platformer or a run and gun or a beat 'em up or anything else because it's not.
You'd give it like a prefix. So instead of saying it's a shmup, you'd say it's a manual scroll shmup. Like you'd give it a prefix. Because it's so close, you just need that little prefix there to kind of clarify, okay, it's a shmup, but it's not mainline. It has a little quirk here, which is you control the scroll. So something like a
And to be fair, I never called it a shmup. I always just called it a shooter, which it is. So it makes it easy.
Right, yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up,
subgenre
too,
or not, I don't know.
I would say we'll save this for a little bit later, till the last criteria, but I kind of also want to say, like, I like to have like a 50% rule because whenever we have these conversations on Discord, it always comes up like, oh, Metal Slug 3 has a shmup section, right? There's no doubt there's a section in Metal Slug 3 where it goes shmup mode, where it says, all right, boys, you're in the plane, it's shmup time. So for that, I would say, okay, the game needs to be doing these core elements at least 50% of the time. So Nier Automata does it a few moments. That doesn't make Nier Automata a shmup. It has a shmup section, but it is not overall a shmup. So I'd say at least if it's got to be doing it at least 50% of the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's tons of games out there that have shmup stages, and that, you know, it doesn't
Mario
make the entire game shmup.
yeah.
You know, so I totally get that. And there's interesting auto-scrolling. I'm working on this Konami video, and like the old game Time Pilot. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Mm-mm.
You know, it's because it's always scrolling, but you're controlling the direction of the scrolling. So you're always at the center of the screen, and you're moving the direction you're pointing. So the game is constantly scrolling. You can't stop it, but you can control the direction. So you can be going up,
like that
left,
as well.
right.
Blackbird,
and it's very interesting because it is auto-scrolling, but you're controlling the direction of the scrolling at all times. You can't stop it.
I think Blackbird is like that as well, but I'll have to double check. I'm pretty sure Blackbird, it's a newer indie shmup that came out a few years ago. It's actually really cool. Yeah, you can turn, right? It's kind of like Fantasy Zone. You can turn, but you can't stop it, I'm pretty sure. It just keeps going.
Even Fantasy Zone, like, you control the scrolling. So Fantasy Zone stops.
Yes, Fantasy Zone does
Defender stops. This is literally like, imagine playing a shmup, but you can turn, but it's almost like Mercs. Like, whichever direction you turn, the screen automatically scrolls in that direction and fast.
Right.
So you don't have to move for the screen to scroll. It's literally scrolling in whatever direction you're pointing.
Yeah.
And the way you dodge bullets is literally by manipulating the direction the screen is scrolling.
That's really
like
interesting.
It's the actual primary mechanic of the game. That's how you dodge.
Right. That's really interesting.
It never really caught on. There's not a lot of games like Time Pilot, but it's
I can understand why.
But it's a good game. It's really unique, and it's, you know, a lot of people like it. So it's one of those weird outliers that it does fit the description. But I don't know if it would be considered a shmup. I mean, it certainly is a shooting game.
Like, what I'm saying here is you would give it a little bit of a prefix to it because it's close enough. It has enough of the elements. It's just right there on that line. But now that we have kind of an idea of the element, when you submit Doom to Shmup Slam, I can say, okay, Doom does not have 8-way movement. You know, you're stuck on the ground, gravity. It also does not auto-scroll, so you don't have that. So really the only thing Doom has is the emphasis on projectiles and dodging projectiles. So that at least you have a criteria to start gauging things and how close they are to the ideal core of what a shmup is. But anyway, let's get to the final criteria. I think this one's the most straightforward, but there's a little nuance, which is I think the combat needs to be centered around avoiding projectiles. And a lot of people, we've talked about this and we've said, well, shouldn't it be shooting and avoiding projectiles? I'm a little bit more lenient because there's some shmups where you don't have to shoot anyone. You can just dodge stuff, pacifist style. I think Garegga you can do that. You don't need to shoot at any point. Or Radiant Silvergun, you could just swing your sword the entire time, not shoot, right? Just swing the sword. But because you have to still maneuver around projectiles, you still have to herd them and make them behave how you want them to behave. It's still testing the core shmup skill set, in my opinion. What do you think about that final criteria?
I'm definitely on board with that. I don't think that it's necessary for you to have to be able to shoot and destroy things for it to be able to be considered a shmup, which is funny because when you consider something being called a shooter or a shooting game, the whole idea is that you're shooting.
At least you're getting shot at. There's at least that criteria.
Or you're attacking or something along those lines. But I think it's one of those exceptions where as games evolve, different companies came up with, new innovative mechanics and
like
ways
Touhou,
to...
Touhou's funny because I'm doing air quotes here, you shoot. There's a Touhou offshoot game where you shoot, but you're shooting with a camera. So you take pictures of things. So it's a shooting game, but you're shooting with a camera.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely on board with that. In older shooting games, shooting was more a central part of the game where your shot isn't so huge and you had to do a lot of aiming.
Yeah,
and that was a core part of the gameplay. Whereas with newer shmups and cave style games, your shot is so massive that there really is no shooting. You're just holding down the button.
Right, and you're
covering
dodging
the entire screen with your shot.
It's more about the dodging, yeah.
Yeah, it is a dodger as opposed to a shooter because you really don't have to aim at anything.
Right. Last time think about the last time you watched a Cave Super play and the guy's like, dude, sick aim. That guy, he nailed that shot. Aim is impeccable. No, everyone says sick dodges. You're dodging like a madman. Your dodging skills. No one's like, oh man, you're nailing those precise bullets in Dodonpachi. That doesn't happen. Maybe in Dodonpachi a little bit with the chaining system, so that's not a good example, but...
Yeah, no, so I'm on board with that. I don't think it's absolutely a requirement for any of these games, but as long as it fits within the mechanics, as long as it makes sense for the game, there's a lot of ways you can attack and kill enemies or avoid enemies.
Yeah, and just to clarify one possible question people might have, which is, well, what if they're attacking you with melee attacks? And I say, okay, now it's a beat 'em up. If it goes from projectiles to melee, you have entered beat 'em up land, because that is literally what a beat 'em up is all about.
There's
avoiding
exception.
melee attacks. And well, you know what I mean? Primarily, right? So there's exceptions in beat 'em ups where, like Alien versus Predator or something, where they come on screen and shoot at you. But, the majority of the time in the game is dealing with people hand to hand. So I'd say now you're a beat 'em up if you start focusing on melee combat.
Well, what's really common in shooting games is the enemies being the projectiles themselves too. So they're kamikaze. So there's a lot of games like that, especially the older ones where they're dive bombing you or they're attacking you. So it doesn't have to be them shooting. They could literally be using their, hitbox as
right. Yes. Yes. At least they are a form of a projectile, right? Like a kamikaze. Yeah. When he goes to ram his plane into a boat, he becomes a bullet, right? He is the bullet at that point. So I guess that's what you think about.
That's extremely common, especially in the older games, more so.
Right. Yeah.
Than Danmaku. So that all counts. That's all fair game. Yeah. And I was saying that's actually really common in Lords of Thunder. Is most of the enemy. There's not a lot of projectiles in that game, and most of the damage is from being attacked directly by enemies running into you, which is why you have a melee attack. For close range combat as well.
Right,
so,
yeah.
You have a melee attack and so do they, but it's very much a shmup in every sense of the word.
Right, yeah. Definitely add in some melee spice, absolutely. Like Radiant Silvergun, of course, or Zero Ranger. You got a sword and you're slicing people up with the sword. I love that stuff. But the majority of the time, you're dodging bullets, and it's actually kind of fun because you have to figure out a way to dodge around stuff with your little sword and hit them with the sword. And so the last part of this I thought would be really interesting to talk about is I wanted to get your thoughts on the genres related to shmups that would still fall under the shooter category, and just kind of how you think about these genres. For example, we were talking a little bit earlier about running guns, one of my favorite genres as well. So what do you think about the running gun genre as far as kind of your understanding coming from they were once just a shooter, like a shmup, I'm assuming?
Not really.
Right. What do you think about that?
At least back then, we never thought of running guns like Contra as shooters because they were so specific and such a unique type of game. and they didn't share the same mechanics really. So,
Right.
whenever I talked about any of those types of games back then, I've never called it a shooter.
What were
if
they called?
anything, if it wasn't called a run and gun, it was just a platformer. In my mind, all those types of games, at the core of their gameplay, the shooting is not the core of the gameplay in Contra, it's platforming.
Right.
And you could say that for Ghouls and Ghosts. You can say that for, a lot of these games. In general, and this is kind of my thoughts on the whole criteria thing, because I'm someone that generally tends to resist categorization and criteria, and I understand its importance. But at the same time, my approach has always been, what is the primary challenge? The primary gameplay challenge? What is the core of the gameplay? And that's usually what determines a genre for me. So instead of looking at criteria and saying, okay, well, it has to be this, this, and this, which I totally understand. I always categorized games in my mind by what their primary gameplay challenge is. If you're programming a game, let's say you're coding Contra,
Yes.
you're not starting with the enemies, you're not starting with shooting, you're starting with traversing the stage. Whether it's Contra or Mario or Castlevania or any of these games, you have to be able to traverse the stage, whether it's running or jumping or sliding or whatever you're doing, regardless of whether there's enemies. The enemies and the shots come later. They're there to make the stage more difficult. But traversing the level through whatever gameplay means is the primary challenge. So to me, Contra was always a platformer, despite the fact that you're, shooting and dodging bullets and things like that. It was never a shooter or a shmup, especially because platformers were so popular back then. They're like the genre.
Yes.
During the 8-bit days in arcade and even 16-bit.
Yeah.
And it was my favorite. I loved them. So I don't really differentiate between a game like Contra and Ninja Gaiden, for example, because it doesn't matter that you're not shooting a gun and swinging a sword. The gameplay is the same. The core gameplay is platforming, regardless. And that's where it gets tricky with games like Metal Slug, because Metal Slug has such a small amount of platforming that it's almost questionable, because you're not really platforming anymore. You're just running back and forth. You're occasionally jumping, but that's not the core of the gameplay.
Yeah,
Metal
jumping
Slug
is
really
incredibly
is
dangerous in Metal Slug.
Yeah, Metal Slug is very much a shooting game, whereas Contra, in my mind, is a platformer, and a lot of those run and guns are platformers to me. So I never called them shooters back then, because it was a different kind of game. Contra is not Gradius. They're completely different.
Sometimes these genre labels are just too narrow to fully be able to explain, okay, Metal Slug and Contra, a lot of people consider them the same genre, but they're so different from each other, because Contra, like you're saying, you're doing a lot of platforming. Metal Slug, if you see a platforming section in Metal Slug, you roll your eyes come on, really? You're making me platform? What is your problem? We're here to shoot machine guns and blow shit up in tanks. That's what we're here for.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're running and shooting, and that's why people see them as the same game.
Yeah.
So it's but Contra has auto-scrolling stages too.
Right.
But they're very similar games, and that's why I try not to pigeonhole them. But at the end of the day, what I was saying before was, what is the core gameplay? Like Castlevania is an example. It's kind of like the R-type of platformers. Yes, it's slower and it's more methodical, and there's a lot of strategy involved. But at the end of the day, the core of the gameplay in Castlevania, you're fighting enemies, of course.
Yes.
It's the challenging platforming and the enemies that make the platforming even more difficult and knock you off and kill you. It's much more platformer than it is a run, any other genre.
I don't know. I'm saying I don't know what you'd put that under, right? You just kind of shove it under platformer, but it's kind of like doing its own thing.
It was to me anyway. It makes sense as a platformer. But so I look at the core gameplay, and that's what decides in my mind whether something is a shooter or a shmup or a platformer or a beat 'em up. Is if I was programming that game, where do you start? Where do you have to start programming the engine before you get to anything else? What makes the game? Where will the challenge be? And where are the core mechanics? With a beat 'em up, you know what they are. With a platformer, you know what they are. And the same thing with a shmup. When you're dealing with a shmup, you're mostly dealing with auto-scrolling. You don't have to have a background. You don't have to have obstacles. You can literally just have your ship, enemy ships, and bullets.
Yep.
And you can have shmup.
Absolutely.
And that's all you need. And that's what makes up the core gameplay. And that's what you start programming first before you do anything else. And that's what makes a game a shmup. Whereas with Contra or Mario or Castlevania, the core of the gameplay is the traversal of the stage and the challenge of that. It's not what a shooting game is. So that's why when I look at games like In the Hunt, for example, the reason I call it a shmup or consider it one is because I look at what is the primary challenge of the gameplay. It is not platforming. It is not anything but shooting and dodging. That is what In the Hunt is. And that's what makes it a shmup or a shooter to me, even though it doesn't match, like, for example, auto scroll. So
Right.
in any case, it's more of just like a devil's advocate counterpoint. Like, because I've never thought about it in that way before, because I've never tried to categorize it, I generally just look at a game and I look at its primary gameplay challenge. It could have secondary challenges. It could be 50-50. It could be a hybrid. But for the most part, you can always identify that one thing that makes the game what it is, and everything else is ancillary.
So I would say
to
the reason why In the Hunt is sort of an exception is because there are certain strategies you can utilize in the Hunt that you can never utilize in any other auto-scrolling shmup. For
Absolutely.
example, in Metal Slug and a lot of other non-auto-scrolling games, you can do what I like to call slow walking. So rather than moving through the stage at a regular pace, what you can do is you can take these little steps forward, spawn some enemies, kill them, little step forward, spawn some enemies, kill them. Or if you spawn enemies, you can kind of back off, move away. Shmups, you cannot do that. You can't slow walk through the game. That's not a strategy available to you because the game auto scrolls you through. So there's stuff like that, like the sort of meta of how the game works. And I'm sure In the Hunt probably has some sort of timer or some sort of mechanic that's telling you, buddy, you can't just hang out. You have to move.
Yeah, you'll die if you just sit around forever.
But it doesn't have that godlike force just shoving you forward. No matter what you do, you could sit there, you could take the deaths, but you would not move forward. So that's where I think there's kind of a divider there. Is there's just these strategies, and the way the levels are designed is a little bit different because you'd have to account for, okay, how do I prevent the player from slow walking the entire game? Like, how do I stop him from doing that? Those types of things.
And it's okay. I mean, not every shmup has to be the same or play the same or be identical. It's okay for there to be 3 or 4 different types of shmups, that maybe play slightly differently from each other. Like In the Hunt, as an example, like if you want to give it a subgenre or some kind of a prefix, if you want to get complicated about it.
Non-auto-scrolling shmup, something like that. No auto.
But at the end of the day, I would consider it a shmup up over and above a different type of game.
Yes,
because of the core of its gameplay. And that's also why, I consider games like Wolfing and even Metal Slug potentially more of a shooting game or a shmup than something else, because what else would it be?
I'd give Metal Slug the run and gun. I'd still give it run and gun. Probably.
But run and gun is definitely distinct from shmup, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I never saw run and guns as part of the shooting genre. Like, I know the wiki even calls it part of the shooting genre, but I always thought they were separate. I always thought of them as kind of platforming games. But you're right in the fact that Metal Slug is not really a platformer in any way.
Yes. Yeah, you platform one time in the game and you're like, why developer? Just come on. We all know why we're here. Yeah, especially that game, because jumping is so risky in Metal Slug. If you jump, you're dead. Yeah.
So, I mean, in my mind, in a shmup, the primary challenge is shooting and dodging. Traversing the level is secondary. It's not the primary challenge of the game. That doesn't mean there aren't sections where you have to memorize where to go and what to do or whatever, but that's not the primary challenge of the game. And that's what makes a shmup for me. In the Hunt, traversing the level is not the primary challenge.
Right.
It's shooting and dodging. That's what I consider it. Whereas with Contra or any of these other games, traversing the level is generally the primary challenge. So that's why I kind of lump it into something else, even though you're still shooting and you're still dodging. And
the tricky part, though, is you can start to get this bleed over where this comes up a lot. Okay, why isn't Doom a shmup then, right? Doom, the primary concern is shooting and dodging. So that's where I think these other criteria are really good, because you say, okay, well, why isn't Doom a shmup? Like, right? If In the Hunt's a shmup, why isn't Doom a shmup?
It's good. It's a good point. Like I said, I don't know if Doom is the primary challenge, shooting and dodging, or is there more to it than that?
I know
so. In my mind, Doom is like Wolf 3D, Doom, all those games are more exploratory than anything else. I mean, that's not what the game is about. That's not the challenge. But the way the levels are structured, it's not open world completely, but it's in that sense where especially Doom and anything after Doom, you're spending most of your time exploring the level. Like you're looking for where to go. It's like just the gameplay is so different.
Well, I guess maybe if you're
than
playing like, what's it
everything
called,
else.
like ultra kill mode or whatever, where it's just like pure enemy chaos in there, where it's just, that's kind of the mode I always think of,
Yeah.
rather than like the regular
Yeah.
mode, I guess. But
like if Doom was just a straight on kill fest where
yes,
you were literally going straight, you could go left to right, you can
Yeah.
back up, but you're just going straight on, then I would say yeah, it is a shmup or it's a shooter, even though you're moving, because it literally has all the same mechanics just in 3D.
yeah,
Because
the place
the
I would
primary
say
goal
is
is just to get
different
from point A to point B and kill everything on the way.
Yeah, the place I would say it's different is it needs to auto scroll, and then you need to be able to move in all 8 directions, basically fly, because otherwise it's more like a 3D running gun, right? If you're just moving forward through a corridor, but you can't fly around the objects, I think the flying aspect is still why people say, okay, why is Star Fox a shmup? And I said, well, Star Fox, you fly, you move in all 8 directions like a shmup. But Doom, you do not fly. You're stuck on the ground. So it's more along the lines of like a running gun, because there's gravity involved here. So you can't fly around the objects and stuff.
By that token, there's these, you may not know the game, but back around when Doom and all these other games were out, there's another PC game called Descent. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's think of Doom, but in a spaceship.
Do you auto scroll?
No, absolutely not. It's
Okay.
just like a Doom game. You're basically you're exploring, you're shooting, the movement is similar.
Yes.
It's
like
but it's a spaceship game, so you
It's
do
like
you can't
Defender.
fly. You have
It's like
full movement
Defender
in
in
every
3D.
direction. It's a 3D game,
Yeah.
and you're not locked down, but the mechanics are still exactly the same as a first-person shooter.
Right.
Except it has 8-way movement. You're not locked down, but I would never call the game a shmup. It doesn't play like one.
Right,
in any-
because it doesn't
in
have
any
that
sense of the
auto
word.
scroll. I think 3D is really useful too, because 3D starts to really emphasize the consequences of a mechanic, right? Because in a 2D game, like the auto scroll, it's just moving you forward, right? It's just moving you. But in a 3D game like Star Fox, it's moving you forward, but in 3 dimensions, right? So there's like that Z-axis coming into play. It's like, okay, this is clarifying now. This is clarifying the fact that, okay, Star Fox is clearly different than this other game where you can do everything, but you're not pushed forward, right? It's just such a fundamental change because there's more complexity in 3D design rather than 2D.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't argue that something like Doom isn't a shooting game. It's just it's different kind. It's called first-person shooting
That's right,
game for a
first
reason.
person, yeah.
But it's definitely not a shmup in any sense of the word.
I would consider like the first-person shooter to be kind of like an outcrop of the running gun and the multi-directional shooter. You like shoved those two together and put it in 3D, and that you kind of get an FPS out of it.
Yeah, the only difference is that platforming in 2D is great, and platforming in 3D usually sucks.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Oh my
whenever they put
god!
it in
Did you
there,
ever
it's always
play
like-
Turok?
yeah, what's that?
Did you ever play Turok?
Oh
It's-
yeah, I remember.
Oh my god!
finishing
Do you
both of
remember
them on
the
N64,
platforming
yeah.
sections in that game? Holy
Ugh.
shit!
It ruins the game.
Oh my god! So hard, so brutal.
There was a time where I played the hell out of FPS games, but at some point, I just got it was oversaturation. Like I just
Yeah.
got tired of it, and I just stopped. Like I haven't played one in like forever. I can't remember when, but I used to play the hell out of them too when they were new.
Yeah, I'll still pop open some boomer shooters. Those I still like those a lot because they have more of an arcade sort of feel to them rather than modern shooters. Basically, it's whenever Halo and all these other shooters decided let's use cover systems, that's when I was like, oh boy, because you can't just run around and dodge stuff and shoot stuff anymore. You have to take cover and all that stuff.
And dodging is completely different in 3D. That's part of it. With most
Yeah.
shooting games and shmups, you have a hitbox. You know what your hitbox is.
Right.
You don't have that with first person.
That's right.
It's coming at you, and you hope it misses when you move
Right.
out of the way. There's
A
no
lot of
precision in that sense.
Yeah, a lot of strafing in 3D dodging. You're doing a shitload of strafing in 3D.
Yeah, exactly. So it's completely different when it comes to dodging. I don't even know if I would consider dodging a gameplay feature of like FPS games, because you are, but you're kind of haphazardly strafing around.
Yeah.
It's a different type of strategy. You're not dodging
Absolutely.
patterns like you're doing in a shooting game.
That's right. That'd be crazy, though. That'd be an interesting game. I'd love to see it. Someone attempted it. an FPS, but you have to like precisely dodge bullet patterns and stuff. That could be pretty cool.
If you know what your hitbox is, I mean, that's the problem, is you don't see yourself.
Right, your hitbox would have to like float, like your hand would have to be your hitbox or something. I don't know. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts. I wanted to get your thoughts because you've been around and you've seen the genre evolve and go through these different terms and everything. And so I wanted to get your perspective as well. Someone who went through a long period calling them shooters.
I pretty much said everything I can think of on the matter. Is I never thought much about it until I had to start calling them shmups, and I started to realize I had started to realize kind of the term that we lost and what that entailed, and that the word shmup meant a lot more than just shorthand for shoot 'em up, like I mentioned before.
Yes.
So, I'm not bitter about it anymore. That was a long time ago. But at the same time, it's just old habits die hard. When I refer to older games, I refer to them as shooters just because it's habit. And when I refer to like newer games, I refer to them as shmups.
Right. Yeah, that makes it a little easier, right? Like a newer game comes out, you can say, oh, that's a shmup.
I have a feeling that, it's going to be hard to get any group of people to agree on criteria like this, and there's always going to be exceptions. And
yes,
I'll be curious to see what the comments are.
This is at least an attempt, like a solid attempt, because I'm telling you, so Wikipedia could at least say, this one dude came up with this criteria. Well, now, whether you accept it or not, that's up to you, but at least it's been attempted. I can sleep at night.
The only thing I don't like doing and I want to avoid is I don't want to pigeonhole, any particular genre to where it becomes kind of exclusive or elitist, or where, people don't want to get into it because it's being made too complicated.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I want to explain my perspective on this, because I think it's different than a lot of other players. I have a real soft spot for almost the entire shooter family, even FPSs. Like, I love running guns. I love shmups. So to me, if you say, oh, it's not a shmup, to me, that's not like a death sentence. Like, oh, banish you, get out of here, right? Because I consider, oh, well, if it's a running gun or a shmup adjacent game, I love those too. And I always accept those types of games into shmup slam and stuff. Like, I'm not gonna be like, oh, it's not precisely a, these three criteria, but the family, I think, if you can get it into that family, I think it's just an easier way to understand it.
Yeah, and I like the idea of keeping it simple, because if you make it too complicated and there's more than like 3 criteria or something like that, then people don't want to deal with it because it's too much. And
yeah,
that's kind of why I always had the approach of, okay, well, I'm not gonna set any rigid standards. I'm not gonna create a criteria, but I'm just going to say, I'm going to look at a game and say, what is the primary gameplay mechanic? What is the challenge?
Yes.
What is the game all about? How was it programmed? And kind of based on that is usually in my mind,
that's
and
a
that's
really
where
good way
we'll
to
end
look
up
at it.
And that's where it's okay to agree to disagree, or I might say, you know what, in my mind, this is a shmup. And you might say, no, it isn't really, because it doesn't match this.
Right.
And that's fine.
Now come up with some crazy term for it. It's a auto-scrolling run and gun, or whatever I might call it.
But in my mind, it's just an easy way to, like, without being complicated, of categorizing a game of, what I see it as, and just because of what it plays like. Again, you can create all these categories, but when you play a game, you kind of know what it is, just by what it feels like to play. And
absolutely,
you can categorize it in your mind without looking at criteria, without saying, okay, well, it does this, but it doesn't do that.
Right.
You just, what kind of a game it tends to feel like, just because it is, because it more closely matches that than it matches anything else, even if it doesn't perfectly apply.
Yeah, and I think the most entertaining is when this happens in like mainstream genre games and critics are like, what the hell is going on here? Like Devil Daggers. It's kind of funny to read reviews and kind of commentary on Devil Daggers and the new sequel that's out, Hyper Demon, which I'm definitely going to play. Because people are like, what is going on with this game's design? But if you're in line with like arcade game design and how arcade game design works, they're like, oh my god, it's an FPS game with arcade style design. That's what it is. But mainstream critics are like, they're like, what is this? What's going on here? So yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying, where you don't want to get too caught up on the genre definitions, because you might find hidden gems in genres that you don't typically expect.
Yeah, and sometimes they're just uncategorizable. There's hybrids out there that you really, you can't. So you just have to make exceptions for them. Atomic Runner is tough because it's both a platformer and a shmup at the same time. It basically meets all the criteria
Yes.
of shmup, but it also kind of meets all the criteria of a platformer. Auto scrolling doesn't negate it from being a platformer. So there's just games like that do it perfectly, and they do it well.
Well, this is also vindication, in my opinion, for the Touhou fans out there, because there was a long time where people were like, Touhou's not a shmup. and then the Touhou players would be like, why not? I don't see any spaceships, bro. Where are the spaceships? But Touhou obviously matches all criteria. Auto scrolls, 8-way movement, emphasis on dodging projectiles. It's classic shmup and all of the
It's
criteria.
a shmup, it's a shooter, it's a shooting game. It's
Yeah.
like the very definition of a traditional, shooting game. I mean,
So that's why I'm saying I think my definition, if it's not perfect, I think it captures at least 90% of the games, which I think is a big accomplishment over, shmups, whatever. We don't even know. Move on. So I'm
all
really happy
all
they won.
shmups are shooters, but not all shooters are shmups.
That's right. That's exactly the slogan. You should do that as like a Christmas special. You should do like a t-shirt for Christmas for that.
Right. Well, this is my shirt, and anybody that wants to buy one can go on my merchant store and get it.
I need to get one. I absolutely need to get one. Especially after this video and after I subjected you to this video. Out of honor, I need to get one.
Well, it's been fun.
Before we go, definitely, Shmup Junkie, tell us where to find you. Tell us what you're up to, because everyone loves your channel.
I'm sure not everybody loves my channel. There's always people that get annoyed at my screwing around and dumb skits sometimes. Although I haven't done one in a long time.
I was going to bring that up, but I was like, where's the skits? Because I was hoping for I heard there'd be like a Tim skit where Timmy skit where he'd be wearing an Electric Underground shirt, and I was so excited for that. I'm like, where is it?
It's gonna happen sooner or later.
Where
I've
is
got
it?
your shirt. It's sitting right here. It's gonna happen.
Yes. So
It's
don't listen
taking
to
a break.
them. Timmy needs to make a comeback, especially wearing the shirt.
Yeah. Well, you can find me under Shmup Junkie. Easy enough. And what I'm working on the every Konami shooter ranked and reviewed video. Another one of those massive, most likely 3+ hour, historical / 60+ games.
Konami,
Extravaganza.
though, it's going to
So
be hot. Konami's a gold mine. Everyone loves Konami.
Or at least they used to.
Well,
Right.
yeah. we don't talk about modern Konami here. Konami died in 2012. That's just how we roll around here.
Well, it's cool that they're, trying to, at least it seems that they've been putting money and resources back into renewing some older, IPs and bringing back some old games. And,
Right.
they're working on Signy that they're funding and, all this other stuff. So, I mean, it's good to see them at least putting resources back into their older games and the arcade style games.
Don't they also
thrilled to
have,
see it.
you're the expert now, so I'm going to ask you, don't they also have control of the Hudson Soft stuff?
Yeah,
Like
Konami owns
Bomberman?
all the Hudson properties. That's why they released the PC Engine Mini. Yeah.
Well, I want a new Bomberman game. Make that happen. I know they have a lot
Right,
of
well,
great IPs, but I loved Bomberman as a kid. You have no idea. Bomberman was my favorite video game character growing up. I made custom merch, a little hat and shirt, because I love Bomberman so much.
Well, next time I'm talking to the Konami guys, I'll let them know that Mark said he wants a Bomberman, so
Yeah.
they need to get on it.
And Bomberman with shooting influences, bombs that are you dodge the bombs a little bit. I love classic Bomberman, but if they want to go a different direction, I could see a shmup Bomberman happening. That would be cool.
Yeah, I said all I can and I'm allowed to say is, people will be surprised to see, what comes out of Konami over the coming years. They're putting a lot of resources into bringing back old games and old IPs and things like that. So nothing is set in stone, but compared to what they used to do, which was nothing, it's really
Pachinko
exciting
or
to see
whatever.
them. Yeah,
they're up to.
it's exciting to see what they're doing again and, getting back into. I'm excited to see it for sure.
Yeah, I love Konami. They were one of my favorite studios. And, well, I forgive you, Konami. Just come back, make some games. It's all right. Kojima did fine. He's doing all right. Let's
hire
make
some
games.
good studios. Hire some good studios to
Yeah.
make the games, like they did with Gradius 5. Like they hired Treasure, and
hell yeah, that was
made a great
amazing.
game. So
that was amazing.
we understand that they don't have the same staff they used to. You can't recreate, the original Gradius games. But
Mhm.
if you find the right studio to make, new games, the sky's the limit. It just depends on who does the work.
Yeah, I wonder who they could even hire now. The shmup the Shmup Studios are a rough business right now, as far as no one's making stuff. I guess M2, but yeah,
they've got
M2.
their
That would be the
hands full.
candidate, I would say, probably.
Right. Yeah, and who knows? I mean, they did Rebirth.
That was excellent. So yeah, get in contact with M2 Konami.
All right. I don't know how we got onto that tangent. Oh yeah, that's right, because I'm working on the Konami shooter video.
Yes.
So yeah, it's gonna be a while, but look for that hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks, if I can get it done.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Absolutely, I'm looking forward to it because I know the mainline Konami shmups, but I don't know the deep cuts, and I want to. That's what I love about these videos that you do. That you always pop up with these really deep cuts. I'm like, I didn't even know this game existed. Like that Wolf game. It's like I didn't know this shit was real. So I'm sure you're gonna find some real good ones for Konami.
Oh, they had some good ones too. Some of the really, really old early stuff. Some of it's a little janker, kind of like looks it's kind of like a side project. When it was early Konami. But there's a couple in there. They're like, damn, this game is really good. Why didn't it do better? Why isn't it more popular? Or it is popular, but it's so old that it just kind of
disappeared.
got forgotten.
Yeah,
got forgotten. But I played. I'm like, wow, this game's really fun. It's really kick-ass. So I'm gonna highlight it.
Well, awesome. Thanks for coming on, man. I'm really excited to chat with you and get this topic off my chest. Thank God.
It was fun. And we'll look forward to seeing the comments.
Oh, absolutely. The comment section is going to be delightful and fun on this one. It's going to be a good time. I like a feisty comment section, so it's going to be a good time.
Good for engagement.
Yes, that's right. Alrighty. Adios, everyone.
Bye.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, Bo, Ben, Bettino, Blur SDG, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Chris Yuzufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Climby Coyote, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Darren Griffin, Disco Staslea, DJ420 Praise It, Eric H, Fantaside, FCK, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, J, JLab, JBRPG, John Kelly, Gameboy Gru, K, K2, KZ, Khalil Reedy, Contain, Larridge, Malaise, Matthew Dergish, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Mechalin, Michael Stum, Mitchell Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Psycho Blizzard, Rattlecat, Raoul, Real Skeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Sarah, Scanline City, Seesaw SDG, 7 Overdose, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Steve Fiction, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, TRM, Sugumo, Twilight EX, Utakoi Roots, Wabby Legs, Bog Hog, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.